Introduction of characters and setting. Allow me to take you on a journey deep into the heart of American aristocracy, where dazzling facades sometimes mask unthinkable tragedies. Our story unfolds amidst the dazzling city lights and old money grandeur of the East Coast, specifically in Upper East Side Manhattan and the political heart of Washington, D.C. These are places where exclusive galas fill marble halls, dynastic families shape the country behind closed doors, and every generation inherits not just fortune but the heavy weight of expectation and legacy. Our main characters, whose lives seem pulled from the pages of a modern-day American fairy tale, are the product of such environments. He, whom we'll call Alexander Washington Chase, hails from an old-line East Coast family with roots tracing back to the American Revolution. His ancestors rubbed shoulders with presidents and tycoons. His last name alone opens doors in the financial district, Ivy League universities, and elite social circles. The Washington Chase family owns a sprawling business empire spanning finance, oil, real estate, pharmaceuticals, even major American media holdings. Alexander, an only child, grew up between historic mansions in Manhattan and vacation estates in the Hamptons, schooled at the most prestigious institutions from Exeter to Harvard. He presents the typical image of a prince of American aristocracy, well-educated, polished, yet shadowed by the privilege and scrutiny that come with a gilded last name. Our protagonist, whom we'll call Charlotte Carter, is the second daughter of a renowned American diplomat whose career has crisscrossed continents. Her father, Ambassador Carter, served as the U.S. envoy to both France and the United Nations, representing American interests abroad with distinction and charisma. Charlotte inherited her mother's intellectual finesse. Her mother was from a historic Boston family with deep roots in art, education, and philanthropic pursuits. Charlotte's childhood, spent traveling between capitals and embassies, exposed her to international culture, diverse languages, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. Possessing a gentle temperament, cultured tastes, a passion for animals and the arts, and a sincere drive to make the world a better place, she grew up shielded by both affluence and the rarefied air of global diplomacy. On the surface, Alexander and Charlotte embody everything that makes America's elite both intoxicating and intimidating: beauty, intellect, connections, and the means to shape their own destinies. Friends, family, and onlookers view them as the ultimate power couple. He, the heir to an empire; she, the daughter of a statesman representing the promising union of business acumen and diplomatic poise. Yet beneath the shining surface lies a world hemmed in by tradition, expectation, and, at times, a dangerous sense of entitlement that the rules do not always apply. The setting is a modern America, post-2010s, where social divides still run deep, cultural expectations persist, and private tragedies among the privileged continue to ignite public outrage. We witness not only their lavish courtships, high-profile social appearances, and philanthropic endeavors, but also the pressures, secrets, and vulnerabilities fostered behind the high gates and historic walls. Their story, though singular, will turn out to mirror the struggles and dangers faced even by women of the highest echelons in society, a cautionary tale with implications far beyond their private world. The tragic event. There are moments in the history of American high society that sear themselves into the public consciousness, casting a long, chilling shadow over the marble halls and golden facades of privilege. The night of July 18, 2021, stands as one of those moments, a date that forever altered the trajectory of two-storied families and captivated the nation. On this night, in one of Manhattan's most exclusive addresses in the Upper East Side, tragedy unfolded behind the silent gates, shattering illusions of safety and invulnerability for even the most insulated elite. Charlotte Carter, the luminous, thoughtful daughter of a distinguished diplomat, trusted friend, animal lover, and blossoming artist, arrived at Alexander Washington Chase's grand family estate, as she had done many times before. What distinguished this evening from any other seemed at first like only a subtle undercurrent of tension between the two. Yet, for Charlotte's parents, the pattern quickly veered from the familiar to the alarming. Late night, she ceased replying to their texts. Worry burrowed deep into their hearts as hours slipped by with nothing but silence. By morning, that dread crystallized. Despite desperate attempts at contact, from calls by friends and family to increasingly anxious messages, there was only a singular sterile voicemail assuring them she was safe. Unbeknownst to her parents and everyone watching from the outside, Charlotte was fighting for her life within the opulent but suffocating confines of the Chase mansion. What unfolded over those agonizing hours would later be pieced together from security camera footage, digital forensics, and the testimony of staff. The reality was as grim as any crime thriller the public had ever encountered. Sometime between late evening and dawn, a violent altercation erupted, sparked, as the investigation would later theorize, over unfulfilled expectations and mounting emotions. Charlotte, who had shown signs of wanting to end their relationship, attempted to leave. Doors were locked, staff hovered anxiously in the periphery, and Alexander, the scion of a legendary dynasty raised to believe in the primacy of his family legacy, refused to let go. The atmosphere, the digital trail would reveal, devolved swiftly from confrontation to outright danger. Hours passed. Neighbors reported muffled screams echoing out from the property, but the walls of old money have always been adept at silencing pleas for help. Charlotte's final attempts to escape, captured in blurry, grainy surveillance clips, showed her trying to flee, only to be blocked by security and household employees complicit by action or inaction. By the time first responders arrived, the scene was one of devastation. Blood spattering imported floors, objects broken, signs of a desperate struggle everywhere. Charlotte's life, filled with hope and promise, was violently taken from her at the hands of someone she had trusted most in the world. The details, initially withheld from the press out of respect, but later revealed in heartbreaking clarity during court proceedings, sent shockwaves through the country. Her tragic death was not, as rumors and speculation immediately suggested, a simple domestic dispute. Underneath was a tangle of power, control, desperation for dominance, and the silent complicity of those whose allegiance to the family superseded all else. The Chase family, for generations seen as paragons of prestige, now found itself exposed for its vulnerabilities and its blind spots. In every corner of American media, from cable news to social platforms, Charlotte's last hours became a symbol for the dangers women continue to face, regardless of privilege, for the ways wealth can both protect and imprison, and for the urgent demand for reform and justice in a society that often lets its most powerful players slip through the cracks. This tragedy ignited a firestorm, which would only grow in intensity as more layers were stripped away in the days that followed. It was, in every sense, an American tragedy of the modern era, deeply personal yet undeniably public, extraordinary yet shockingly common in its warning signs, a reminder that some walls, no matter how high, can never truly keep out the truth. Her family and his, a foundation of status. The family backgrounds of both the woman and the man play a crucial role in not only shaping who they are, but also determining the trajectory their fateful story eventually takes. Behind the polished facades and headlines, these families are more than just dynasties wielding unimaginable wealth. They are institutions that define status, set social rules, and often silently dictate the limits of individual freedom within their gilded boundaries. Charlotte Carter is the second daughter in a family whose name alone inspires respect across embassies and social clubs in Washington, D.C. Her father, Ambassador Jonathan Carter, has spent decades expertly representing American interests at the United Nations and in major world capitals, earning a reputation for combining statesmanship with an unshakable moral compass. As a result, Charlotte grew up in a surreal world of glittering galas, diplomatic dinners, private jets, and holiday homes stretching from the Massachusetts coastline to the French Riviera. Yet the privilege was always balanced by her parents' insistence on public service, empathy, cultural fluency, and intellectual discipline. Her mother, Elizabeth Carter, née Winthrop, hails from one of Boston's historically significant families, which trace their roots to the Pilgrims and built their prestige on banking, philanthropy, and education. The Winthrops are old-guard American nobility, whose family crest hangs in Ivy League halls, and whose influence is woven through the very fabric of American society. Charlotte and her sisters were raised in this milieu that prized both accomplishment and character. They spoke several languages, traveled extensively, and were taught from an early age that privilege comes with moral responsibility. The Carter estate in the heart of Georgetown doubles as both a family home and a salon for the country's cultural and political elite. Sunday dinners were as likely to feature world-renowned artists and Nobel laureates as childhood friends. Charlotte herself, while gentle and almost self-effacing, is fiercely talented in the arts, passionate about animal welfare, and deeply committed to using her voice for positive change in society. Alexander Washington Chase's family, meanwhile, defines East Coast privilege at its zenith. The Chases are one of America's so-called founding families, descendants of early revolutionaries, presidents, financiers, and industrialists. The Chase name is synonymous with Wall Street, Ivy League philanthropy, and the preservation of dynastic wealth and influence. Their family empire sprawls across banking, oil, commercial real estate, pharmaceutical giants, and media holdings, with tentacles extending into politics and cultural institutions. Generations of Chases have sat on the boards of museums, universities, and some of the nation's most exclusive private clubs. Alexander, the sole heir to this vast fortune, spent his childhood oscillating between penthouses in Manhattan, a castle-like family home in Connecticut, ski retreats in Aspen, and seaside compounds in the Hamptons. His education was strictly curated, first at elite prep schools such as Phillips Exeter, then at Harvard, followed by international stints at Oxford, and bespoke business programs in Switzerland. The Chase legacy is more than just a last name, it is a set of expectations. Visible yet unspoken pressures to uphold family honor, to lead, to expand the empire. Alexander was raised to believe that almost nothing is out of reach for a Chase, that certain doors will always open, and that power, both social and economic, can shelter, shape, and sometimes distort reality. Beneath all these trappings, both families share a belief in their own exceptionalism. Family rituals, codes of discretion, and an abiding loyalty to the clan's interests are woven into every interaction. Outsiders often see only the successes, the awards, galas, and magazine spreads. But within the confines of these palatial homes, legacy is both a blessing and a burden. For Charlotte, it is the foundation of her empathy and drive to serve. For Alexander, it creates an intoxicating freedom mixed with a perilous sense of entitlement. Both families, in their own way, are products and perpetuators of a distinctly American nobility, one that blesses, blinds, and binds those lucky enough, or unlucky enough, to be born within its walls. A fateful encounter. It was the spring of 2018 in New York City, a season when the city thrums with life, art, and the subtle promise of possibility. The air was brisk, yet full of hope, and the social circuit was abuzz with a series of high-profile events that drew together the creme de la creme of American old money and power. On one such night, at a gala for a prestigious arts foundation held on the upper floors of the newly restored Metropolitan Museum of Art, fate quietly arranged its intricate threads. Charlotte Carter stepped out of the limousine in a tailored dress designed by an up-and-coming artist she mentored. Her mother's subtle emerald earrings glinted under the lights, reflecting her background as a diplomat's daughter, poised, worldly, with a serenity that seemed almost rare in this world of calculated excess. From an early age, she had been taught to float graciously through crowded rooms, yet also to observe, to remember the names of every artist and underappreciated chef, to ask after the lives of serving staff. Her presence was never loud, but always noticed. Inside, music lilted amid crystalline laughter and deals struck with the briefest of handshakes. The guests were a portrait of American aristocracy and ambition. Senators, legacy businessmen, art patrons, the kind of people whose ancestors' names decorated both the city's oldest trust documents and the wings of libraries. Among them, Alexander Washington Chase cut a striking figure. Tall, with an effortless air of confidence that came as naturally as breathing, his navy tuxedo bespoke power and custom tailoring. The slight untame of his hair and the wry humor in his eyes betrayed Ivy League polish dipped in a streak of rebellion, a hint that while the Chase legacy pressed heavily upon his shoulders, he sometimes danced to his own internal symphony. They first spoke near the sculpture terrace, separated from the main reception by a wall of hedges and flickering lanterns, a haven for those hoping to escape the press of expectation. Charlotte was drawn there, taking a quiet moment to admire an early Calder, her favorite, when Alexander approached, glass in hand. Their conversation at first was nothing more than the gentle parry and riposte of two skilled diplomats. Observations about the art, wry commentary about the fashion, a shared amusement at the overwrought speeches echoing from the other room. But as the night deepened, surfaces slipped away. Alexander spoke of his love for jazz, the weight of legacy, his yearning for some unnameable freedom. Charlotte, in turn, revealed her passion for mural painting in underfunded schools, her summers spent volunteering with animal shelters in Europe, and the strange rootlessness of growing up across different continents. They found in each other a rare honesty, an understanding of what it meant to perform for the world while harboring secret ambitions and private doubts. That night did not end with fireworks or grand gestures. Instead, it concluded with a stroll in Central Park, neither caring about paparazzi nor societal eyes, where they shared dreams, lingering glances, and laughter echoing over the silent lawns. If the city, swirling with 1,000 different stories, ever conspired toward fate, it was in that quiet, gentle collision of two souls, shaped and sometimes wounded by privilege. The seeds of something powerful, perhaps dangerous, were sown that night, though neither Charlotte nor Alexander could have known how their meeting would change both their lives, and the legacy of the families they represented, forever. Fateful night and unusual signs. On the evening of July 18, 2021, the city pulsed with midsummer heat and a deceptive tranquility lingered over the manicured lawns of the Upper East Side. Charlotte accepted an invitation to Alexander's townhouse, a palatial residence nestled discreetly among New York's most coveted addresses, a place she had visited countless times before. But beneath the familiar veneer of lavish comfort and seamless hospitality, an eerie undercurrent ran through the night, one only visible in hindsight and to those attuned to the subtle signals of human unease. Earlier in the evening, Charlotte exchanged a handful of texts with her family, promising she would be home late, as she had for many past nights out. Her father, steeped in the thick of international policy meetings, and her mother, busy with a local charity, thought little of it. Life, after all, was a constant overlapping flurry of commitments for a family of their stature, yet, somewhere after midnight, her replies began to dwindle. Messages from her parents grew shorter, peppered with gentle reminders to check in, only to be met with silence. Inside Alexander's home, the mood subtly shifted. Staff who were used to acting as silent sentinels sensed an unspoken tension. A clipped exchange here, a nervous glance there, the clinking of glasses carrying a sharpness rather than celebration. Alexander, usually the picture of affable charm, appeared distracted, his conversation marked with an urgency bordering on agitation whenever Charlotte quietly suggested wrapping up the evening sooner than planned. Neighbors, accustomed to late-night comings and goings in these affluent circles, later recalled seeing a brief commotion at the gated drive. To a casual observer, it may have seemed an everyday quarrel, perhaps a disagreement over a car service or forgotten coat, but Charlotte's voice was higher, edged with distress. Yet within such rarefied air, raised voices are often rationalized away or simply ignored. Around 2 a.m., Charlotte's best friend grew anxious after repeated unanswered messages, uncharacteristic for someone as considerate as Charlotte. The family's group chat went dormant. By 3 a.m., a gnawing sense of something wrong crept upon her parents, prompting a flurry of texts and calls. Finally, as dawn neared, her mother received a brief, almost mechanical voicemail. "I'm fine, just tired. We'll call in the morning." The words were detached, almost as if rehearsed. For her parents, the message brought little reassurance. The timbre of Charlotte's voice, faint and strained, belied the illusion of normalcy she desperately tried to convey. Little did they know, behind those opulent walls, every detail of that night, Charlotte's failed attempts to quietly leave, staff moving uneasily at Alexander's direction, a growing sense of confinement, was a prelude to tragedy. The signs, each individually innocuous or ambiguous, formed a mosaic of foreboding only pieced together when it was far too late. As tragedy unfurled, it became clear that even in the bright lights and privilege of American high society, the norms of civility sometimes mask darkness that no family regardless of power or pedigree is immune to. Discovering death and a chilling crime scene. The morning that shattered the mirage of privilege arrived unceremoniously, greeted by the dull gray light of dawn seeping through the iron-wrought gates of the Chase mansion. At first, the city was oblivious to the storm brewing behind those somber walls. Police scanners crackled to life around 6:02 a.m., reporting a distress call from one of Manhattan's most impenetrable, tightly guarded private residences. The voice that rang out in the operator's earpiece was trembling, barely above a whisper, yet carried the unmistakable edge of horror, a chilling contrast to the detached composure expected from households of this standing. Within minutes, squad cars and an emergency medical team cut through the usual morning traffic, lights flashing, faces grim with anticipation of the unknown. When NYPD officers and paramedics stormed the opulent foyer, the heavy doors opened onto a tableau of chaos that would haunt all present for years. Crystal light fixtures cast fractured beams over marble floors stained and slippery with blood. Expensive antiques, framed landscapes, porcelain statuettes, a vase rumored to have belonged to an early Vanderbilt, lay broken, their pieces scattered in the wake of a struggle. The air was thick with coppery unease, perfume barely masking the acrid tang of fear that lingered. Charlotte Carter's body was discovered in the main sitting room, a dramatic space usually reserved for afternoon teas and dignitary guests. She lay sprawled where she had made a desperate stand. Her silk evening gown, elegant only hours before, was torn and soiled, evidence of a violent altercation. Dark bruises ringed her wrists. Livid contusions traced her jaw and hairline, silent testament to the brutality she endured in her final hours. The paramedics knelt beside her, automatic in their professionalism despite the magnitude of the scene, fingers searching for a pulse they already expected not to find. The first officer, a seasoned detective who had responded to everything from shootings in the Bronx to Wall Street suicides, was visibly shaken. He noted the defensive wounds along Charlotte's arms, the blood on her hands, and the way her nails were broken. Cruel reminders, she fought until the end. But it wasn't just what was visible that painted the horror, it was what the rest of the house suggested. Trailing from the room, across Persian carpets and into the side hallway, were streaks of blood, as if she had tried to crawl or escape, with evidence of intermittent attempts to stand. The nearby French doors were locked from the inside. On the other side of the glass, faint smudges bore the desperate marks of hands pressing in panic against their smooth surface. A shattered cell phone, its screen strobing uselessly, had slid under the couch, an apparent relic of her attempts to call for help. As officers moved deeper into the mansion, they found signs of frantic activity. Staff members clustered in a butler's pantry, faces white and speechless, refusing or unable to say more than a few words when questioned. One maid, trembling, kept repeating, "I heard screaming," before dissolving into tears. Outside, two members of the security staff were seen exchanging terse glances, their uniforms rumpled, radios left on a countertop as though dropped in haste. It soon became clear to investigators that several employees had either willfully ignored or been coerced into ignoring the situation as it spiraled into tragedy. Alexander Washington Chase, the household's only resident besides his now-gone girlfriend, was discovered upstairs in a guest room, sitting on the edge of an unmade bed, blood on his shirt and a glassy-eyed stare unbroken by the arrival of police. When officers addressed him, he seemed disoriented, mumbling incoherently about an argument and wanting it all to stop. It was as if the reality of his actions had not yet pierced the shield of privilege he'd spent a lifetime cultivating. Paramedics, wary of potential substance involvement, immediately conducted a field assessment, noting needle marks on his forearm and several pill bottles scattered across the nightstand. Back in the main hallway, crime scene technicians documented everything with the methodical precision of surgeons. Every drop of blood, every broken vase, every torn scrap of fabric was photographed, bagged, and tagged. Using blue lights and chemical spray, they traced droplets to a curious trail leading through a back stairwell, one that, investigators would soon learn, held a hidden passage used only by house staff and family during emergencies. The security camera feeds, quickly collected from the home's private network, revealed flickering, incomplete footage, blurred figures, sudden rushes of movement, and a crucial window during which the cameras themselves were disabled, evidently by someone with inside access. Outside, neighbors and early risers from the Upper East Side community gathered in shock, kept at bay by crime scene tape and uniformed officers. Most had only ever seen the chases at gala events or in glossy magazines. None could imagine such terror could take root within a stone's throw of their own homes. As news helicopters arrived and the media began to swarm, senior detectives huddled beneath the portico, piecing together the initial timeline. The 911 call had come from one of the junior kitchen staff, who, risking everything, slipped away to make the call while the rest of the household floundered in stunned silence, or attempted to maintain order as instructed by the Chase family discretion code. The call's timestamp was critical, occurring almost 90 minutes after the approximate time forensic experts would declare as Charlotte's time of death, suggesting a delay deliberate or born from collective shock or complicity. Autopsy results would later confirm what the scene so chillingly foretold. Charlotte died of injuries stemming from blunt force trauma, with contributing factors of asphyxiation and blood loss. Marks on her arms and torso indicated a protracted confrontation, consistent with a desperate struggle rather than a quick, impassioned act. Beneath her fingernails, forensic teams recovered skin and fibers matching Alexander's DNA and clothing, a silent, damning testimony sewn into her final fight for life. The medical examiner found shallow cuts along Charlotte's palms, suggesting she had tried to defend herself against a knife. The weapon itself, blood-smeared and bearing partial fingerprints, was later found in a powder room trash bin. On the fireplace mantel, a family photograph lay shattered, its glass dusting the hearth, a cruel echo of the broken family it now depicted. Throughout the investigation, the scene inside the mansion became a shifting labyrinth of statements and silences. The staff, some too frightened to speak, others dreadfully loyal, kept to their prescribed roles, offering up evasive half-truths about the timeline and minimizing their involvement. Meanwhile, lawyers representing the Chase family were quick to descend on the house, instructing household employees not to speak to anyone except legal counsel, and asserting the privacy of the grieving family. Yet the physical evidence overwhelmed attempts to obfuscate. Luminol revealed invisible footprints tracking blood from the sitting room up the stairs, unmistakably matching Alexander's shoes. Partial fingerprints were found on the inside of the French doors and on the doorknob leading to the garden, suggesting at least one frantic effort made by Charlotte to escape. The timeline formed by digital traces, from the final text sent from Charlotte's phone to the abrupt shutdown of the mansion's internal security system, filled in the gaps left by reluctant witnesses. One chilling detail would haunt not only the investigators but the city at large. At approximately 2:37 a.m., not long after the commotion began, a neighbor's security camera across the courtyard captured a solitary light blinking off in the study, followed by a single, faint cry for help carried through an open window. It was a sound almost no one heard. Almost. But for one person who acted where so many did not, and whose anonymous tip proved essential in breaking the conspiracy of silence that threatened to engulf the truth. As Charlotte's body was respectfully removed from the home, the sidewalk outside filled with stunned onlookers. Some quietly wept, others snapped phone pictures, but all sensed that what had unfolded here was not just a family's private tragedy, but a devastating rupture in the illusion of safety and civility that wealth so often promises and so rarely truly provides. In those harrowing hours, the Chase mansion transformed from a symbol of unreachable affluence to a scene of grief, guilt, and irrevocable loss. The discovery of Charlotte's death, recounted in headlines across the nation, became a watershed moment, forcing a reckoning not only for the individuals involved, but for an entire society forced to confront the dark truths lurking behind gilded doors. Investigation and complex details. As dawn faded into a heavy, uncertain morning, the world outside the Chase mansion began to churn with rumors and speculation, but inside, detectives and forensic teams were methodically transforming a scene of tragedy into an intricate chessboard. The investigation into Charlotte Carter's death was no ordinary homicide inquiry. It was a relentless, high-profile operation, bristling with the pressures and pitfalls that only come with wealth, notoriety, and deeply entrenched family legacies. From the outset, the team from the New York Police Department knew that nothing about this case would be straightforward. As news of the incident began to seep into the city's social circles, walls of secrecy and deference to the powerful immediately emerged. But Chief Investigator Marissa Brody, an unflappable veteran with a reputation for pursuing justice regardless of social standing, was determined to piece together the real story behind the night's events, shrouded though it was in privilege and blurred by conflicting accounts. The mansion itself was an enigma. Built for privacy and opulence in equal measure, it posed immediate challenges for an unimpeded investigation. Layered security systems, rooms accessible only by coded doors or private lifts, and many areas watched by a closed-circuit surveillance system maintained by the Chase family's private tech consultants. It quickly became apparent that some footage from critical timeframes had been tampered with, revealing gaps and abrupt camera shutdowns. Digital forensics experts were brought in immediately to retrieve deleted or obscured recordings, establishing a painstaking timeline of the hours leading up to and immediately following Charlotte's death. Within hours, the digital and physical evidence began to converge. Investigators discovered that Charlotte had made several attempts to call and text for help in the late-night hours, messages that never left the estate's Wi-Fi system, as if someone had blocked outbound communications. They combed through the log files for every device registered to the house: cell phones, tablets, laptops, even the internal smart home system. In the shadows of all that elite technology, hidden patterns started to emerge. Attempts at wiping security footage, sudden disconnections from certain cameras, and odd spikes in data traffic just as chaos erupted. Every anomaly was cataloged, cross-referenced, and matched to the physical evidence. Prints on doorknobs Charlotte had tried in vain, her broken phone, the trails of blood, the panic-coded messages left on kitchen whiteboards. Detectives quickly zeroed in on Alexander Washington Chase, whose hazy explanations dissolved under questioning. As the immediate shock wore off, inconsistencies surfaced in his story. He first claimed to have found Charlotte long after a supposed argument, then failed to explain the splatters of blood on his clothing or his own visible injuries. While forensic teams worked around the clock, officers focused on staff and household employees. Some were openly shaken, too distressed to recount more than fragments. Others, clearly frightened, clung to vague, prepared statements obviously shaped by the family's lawyers. Meanwhile, in the NYPD's digital lab, the breakthrough came from analyzing metadata on both Charlotte's and Alexander's devices. Deleted messages between Alexander's parents and several family lawyers indicated an urgent scramble just after midnight, communications with PR teams, and even persuasive outreach to certain members of the local precinct. One set of messages, later uncovered and admitted to court despite privilege claims, revealed attempts to erase digital records and instruct members of the household on what to say or what not to say. The investigation's difficulty was compounded by the Chase family's immense influence. Within 24 hours, some of Manhattan's most formidable attorneys arrived at the precinct, armed with non-disclosure agreements and veiled threats of lawsuits for any procedural overreach. Pressure came from unexpected places. Even high-ranking city officials with close ties to the Chase business empire voiced frustration at the pace and scope of the investigation. Yet, public outrage, fueled by leaking details and mounting calls for transparency, gave the detectives a shield and occasionally leverage. Forensic pathology, meanwhile, added its layer of complexity. The cuts on Charlotte's hands, the severity of her injuries, and the traces of both her DNA and Alexander's under her fingernails painted a picture of protracted, desperate resistance. Medical examiners testified to the drawn-out nature of the assault, contradicting early attempts by the defendant's representatives to downplay what had occurred. The bruising patterns showed multiple attempts at restraint, evidence that she had tried repeatedly to escape. Further supporting evidence came from the internal logs of the estate's smart locks, showing doors locking and unlocking throughout the night, often remotely, clear indications of deliberate confinement. One of the investigation's more shocking turns came weeks later, when a background check on Alexander uncovered a sealed arrest record in Europe, a violent altercation at a boarding school, settled discreetly, and buried with large financial settlements. Close scrutiny also revealed a long pattern of substance abuse, painkillers, amphetamines, and most recently opiates that could have fueled volatility and contributed to the night's escalation. Toxicology results from the morning after Charlotte's death showed both recent usage and old scars. Family members, meanwhile, became entangled in their own web of deceit. Forensic accountants began combing through financial records, payment schedules, wire transfers, service staff bonuses paid out of sequence, legal settlements marked as consulting fees. It was evidence of attempts to buy loyalty or silence. The family's legal team, sensing the growing noose, shifted strategy, from outright denial and obstruction to cooperation in specific areas, involving only select points that painted them in a favorable light. Yet the relentless accumulation of evidence slowly cornered everyone involved. Parallel to the official investigation were efforts by Charlotte's grieving family, who used their diplomatic contacts and international connections to ensure thorough scrutiny. Ambassador Carter personally reached out to federal agencies, resulting in the involvement of the FBI and even international law enforcement agencies, given Alexander's European legal history. With multiple investigative teams collaborating, piecemeal truths were gradually stitched together into a cohesive, damning whole. The investigation also drew upon outside experts, behavioral psychologists to analyze the patterns of escalation within the mansion, cybersecurity professionals to uncover the sequencing of digital tampering, and social media analysts to piece together the real-time reactions and communications of everyone in attendance that night. What emerged was a chilling picture of privilege weaponized to obscure reality. Employees coached to parrot party lines, digital ghosting of evidence, and a pattern of emotional manipulation directed by Alexander and enforced by household staff. A pivotal break came anonymously. A staff member, initially too frightened to speak, decided to submit key evidence. A thumb drive containing unaltered exports of security footage, quietly copied before IT teams wiped the originals at the family's request. The footage gave clear visual confirmation of Charlotte's last attempts to leave, her being blocked and redirected by uniformed personnel, and her visible distress as she pleaded to call her family. It also showed Alexander's erratic behavior, moments of shouting, objects thrown, then minutes later, chilling, predatory calm as he communicated quietly with staff. When shown excerpts of this footage in private interviews, several employees finally broke down, confirming a coordinated effort to delay summoning outside help, and agreeing that explicit orders had come from the top. Despite mounting evidence, the investigation was a marathon of legal maneuvering. Prosecutors had to move quickly, given repeated attempts by the Chase legal team to suppress or exclude evidence, arguing chain of custody violations or undue prejudice caused by leaked information in the press. Meticulously, the lead detectives documented every finding, building a case that not only fingered Alexander as the primary perpetrator but also laid groundwork for charges against key enablers. The media, once kept at bay by the family's PR machine, now became both an adversary and an unlikely ally to justice. As more details surfaced, public protests grew outside the courthouse and the mansion alike. Pressure mounted not just for an indictment but for systemic reform. Renewed scrutiny fell upon the relationship between wealth, power, and accountability in America's justice system. Political figures decried the influence of dynastic families in shaping legal outcomes, while public advocates for victims' rights rallied behind Charlotte's family, putting the system itself on trial. Behind the scenes, layers of complexity only deepened. Investigators continued mapping the intricate relationships among household staff, a network built not purely on employment but on generational loyalty, shared secrets, and often financial dependency. Several had worked for the Chases for decades, their own families indebted to the dynasty's largesse. Initially sworn to silence by legal threats, these employees nonetheless carried visible trauma, some admitting in whispered interviews their shame at not doing more. The Carter family, too, faced a parallel reckoning. For all the refined diplomacy and principled leadership that shaped their public lives, they came up painfully short against the insular machinery of the old-money East Coast elite. Their heartbreak was a public lesson in the limits of even the most privileged forms of protection, and a galvanizing force as they devoted themselves to advocating for transparency, abuse prevention, and victims' rights. Ambassador Carter's calls for oversight of private security services and heightened scrutiny of influential households found an eager audience in a nation reeling from the case. Every new piece of evidence, every reluctant confession, further illuminated the chilling normalcy with which dysfunction had been tolerated and hidden in the name of tradition and stability. Digging deeper, investigators unearthed old complaints, previous incidents of controlling behavior by Alexander, reports of staff being asked to handle or redirect female guests, accounts that had never reached public record because of non-disclosure agreements and quiet settlements. These skeletons, finally brought into the light, shifted the investigation from a simple homicide to a broader social indictment. A cautionary tale about the blindness that privilege can inflict on a family, and a justice system forced to reconsider its own vulnerabilities. As the grand jury convened, the tapestry of lies, cover-ups, and entrenched power began to unravel. Each attempt by the Chase family to use influence, political favors, media manipulation, generous donations to causes, was countered by the mounting clarity of the evidence and the sheer determination of those seeking justice. The criminal charges grew to encompass not just Alexander, but complicit staff, and even relatives who had attempted evidence destruction or witness tampering. The prosecutor's case, built on a complex web of forensics, digital data, psychological profiles, and human testimony, stood as an overwhelming testament to the resolve of the investigative team and to the potential for justice, even in the shadow of immense social power. By the time impaneling grand jurors listened to the closing summary, there was no doubt left as to the deliberate, multifaceted nature of what had transpired. The accident theory, once floated in the earliest hours of the case, was now thoroughly debunked. What confronted them was a tragic, meticulously orchestrated series of events, a modern-day morality tale about power, silence, courage, and the long, painstaking unraveling of a truth that had almost disappeared behind gilded doors. Collusion and cover-up by the powerful family. The aftermath of Charlotte Carter's tragic death sent shockwaves through both the public and private circles of the American elite, yet none were as profound or as shrouded in secrecy as those reverberating through the grand halls of the Chase family. From the very first whispers of investigation, the machinery of a powerful dynasty whirred silently to life, its every cog designed to shield itself from scandal, liability, and accountability at any cost. Unlike the frantic chaos that typically accompanies high-profile criminal cases, the initial hours within the Chase household were marked by a calculated calm. While some staff members trembled under police questioning, family patriarchs and seasoned legal advisors moved swiftly and discreetly. They summoned the family's most trusted attorneys, private investigators, and crisis communication experts, assembling what amounted to a war room in the study lined with portraits of ancestors who had survived every storm American society had ever weathered. Their goal was singular: contain the damage, protect the legacy, and ensure the family's continued untouchability. Within hours, the household was under tight lockdown, not only by law enforcement but crucially by the family's own inner circle. All employees, from housemaids to chauffeurs and private security, received explicit instructions: say nothing to anyone apart from the legal team. Non-disclosure agreements, originally drafted as mere formalities of working in a place of immense wealth, suddenly became chokeholds on the truth. Anyone tempted to cooperate with authorities was gently, then firmly, reminded of the financial and legal consequences. Emergency bonuses were paid out in cash and hush gifts quietly distributed to purchase silence if fear alone was not enough. The cover-up efforts reached into both the digital and physical realms. Cell phones and computers belonging to both Charlotte and Alexander, as well as household surveillance systems, underwent a suspicious routine check by the family's in-house IT team. Minutes of crucial security footage were wiped or corrupted. Deleting digital traces required an orchestrated effort involving experts who had previously managed far more sophisticated corporate breaches for the Chase conglomerate. In parallel, selected staff were coached on the preferred version of events: a misunderstanding, a tragic accident, whatever would play best under scrutiny but not bear criminal intent. Meanwhile, the family's press consultants set to work behind the scenes. Media contacts, cultivated carefully through generations of patronage and philanthropy, were briefed off the record. False leads and distractions were seeded into newsrooms, while some influential reporters were invited to sip scotch in the wood-paneled library in return for balanced coverage. Every effort was made to keep the story framed as an unfortunate incident rather than a scandalous crime. The family's reputation, a tapestry woven over centuries, was at stake. Even minor social connections were leveraged to influence public officials, urging patience and due process, with an undertone of subtle threat lying just beneath the velvet words. The Chase family's influence extended far beyond the gates of their estate. Several of Alexander's relatives held or had held significant positions in finance, media, and city politics. It wasn't lost on investigators that calls from certain city offices, and astonishingly, even from the legal departments at major publications, began to trickle in, inquiring delicately about the status and scope of the investigation. Private donations, previously destined for cultural or charitable foundations, were quietly redirected toward legal defense funds or campaign coffers for those deemed crucial to the Chase's interests. Family elders painted the crisis as an existential threat, not merely to Alexander but to the entire lineage, their social standing, even to the institutions they patronized. Gatherings at the mansion became strategy sessions. Emails and messages coded with euphemism buzzed between silver iPhones. "We must close ranks. Discretion trumps candor. Safeguard the house." There were rallies of loyalty from distant relatives, some out of genuine familial solidarity, others out of a pragmatic sense that their own fortunes were bound to the Chase name. Behind closed doors, a more desperate and human drama unfolded. There was division in the family. A few younger members, more attuned to the changing moral tides of American society, urged a forthright approach, haunted by the thought that truth and healing demanded full transparency. They were, however, overruled by the elders, whose guiding philosophy remained: never let the family image crack. Sacrifice the truth if you must, but never the crown. The complexity of the cover-up grew as the investigation progressed, and the press caught wind of apparent inconsistencies and missing evidence. Private meetings between the Chase legal team and certain officials shifted from polite to adversarial. Lawyers worked around the clock to suppress search warrants, challenge subpoenas, and file procedural motions designed to delay revelation. Every legal maneuver, every public statement was calibrated for both the courtroom and the court of public opinion. Perhaps most chilling was the psychological manipulation deployed internally. Staff were not only reminded of their contractual obligations and possible legal risk, but also made to feel personally responsible for the family's legacy. Generational employees, nannies, butlers, groundskeepers, were subtly reminded of the years they had eaten at the Chase table, the tuition the family had paid for their children, the medical bills settled in times of need. This web of obligation and silence, spun over decades, ensured most would hesitate or simply refuse to cooperate with investigators. even those most haunted by what they had witnessed. Some staff, racked with guilt, quietly debated reaching out to authorities or media, but the threat of economic ruin, or worse, deportation for undocumented workers, was a powerful deterrent. In this chilling atmosphere, one or two household members became essential covert witnesses, ultimately enabling key evidence to be preserved, but only at tremendous personal risk. The vast majority, however, maintained the company line, shrouded in a conspiratorial silence that echoed through every marble corridor as the investigation pressed on. The attempts at obfuscation even reached the families of those few employees who broke ranks. Subtle intimidation tactics appeared, a cancelled scholarship here, a rescinded job offer there. Whispers of blacklisting began to ripple across the small and interconnected world of luxury household staff. It was a masterclass in systemic loyalty coercion, blending generations-old patronage with modern legal intimidation and economic blackmail. Simultaneously, the Chases used their far-reaching charitable and institutional ties as shields. They amplified their public philanthropy, announcing large donations to women's shelters, arts organizations, and even criminal justice reform, causes designed to launder goodwill and distract from the growing storm of negative headlines. At select galas and private dinners they invoked the rhetoric of sorrow, framing Alexander as a deeply troubled but beloved son, and Charlotte's death as a heartbreaking misfortune rather than the result of deliberate wrongdoing. Notes of sympathy delivered to the Carter family were carefully worded, generous but never admitting fault, and always couching the family's concerns in conditional, ambiguous language. This duplicity was not without its cracks. The more the cover-up machinery labored, the more pressure built within its ranks. Inside the mansion, some longtime staff began to unravel, overcome by grief, fear, or fatalism. Information slipped despite the best efforts. A whispered phone call, an anonymous tip, an item handed quietly to a detective. Each breach sent the Chase legal team into a frenzy. Who spoke? How compromised was the secret? And led to even tighter restrictions and new rounds of loyalty confirmation interrogations. For many, working for the Chases during this period became an exhausting and terrifying endurance test. Meanwhile, the Chase family's influence in official circles took on a subtler, insidious form. Beyond outright obstruction, some family members made calculated overtures to key legal officials and investigators, hinting at post-career opportunities or shifting allegiances should things work out. Private dinners at exclusive clubs were arranged nearly overnight, guest lists curated to include the city's most important prosecutors and dignitaries. The message was unmistakable: helping the family could have its rewards. Those who rebuffed these advances found themselves on the receiving end of unmarked envelopes with warnings of media exposés about their own minor failings, skeletons whispered to be released from the family's deep archive of social intelligence. At every step of the process, the complicity and cover-up provided chilling proof that the most significant threat to justice in such high-profile tragedies was not always the absence of truth, but the overwhelming power of money and tradition to drown it out. What remained constant behind the Chases' imposing stone walls was the old-world certainty that with enough influence and enough carefully leveraged fear, any narrative could be bent, any investigation muddled, any outcome delayed or diminished. Yet, as the months passed, and the case survived every stalling tactic and media smokescreen, the cracks in the cover-up gradually fractured. The outside world did not simply move on or lose interest as it had in stories past. Persistent leaks, courageous whistleblowers, and an unusually tenacious legal team meant the Chase's efforts could not wholly prevent the truth from escaping. The Chase family found themselves in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable position, no longer merely the authors of their own legend, but subjects of a cautionary tale, one about privilege, complicity, and the peril of clinging to myth in the face of raw, irreducible tragedy. Public opinion erupts and a wave of justice rises. As word of Charlotte Carter's death and the chilling circumstances shrouding her final hours broke through the ironclad secrecy of the Chase family and seeped into the broader public, the reaction was nothing short of explosive. The case, once thought to be an ephemeral scandal narrowly contained within Manhattan's elite, erupted into a roiling national drama, gripping every corner of American society. Over the course of days and weeks, the private tragedy metastasized into a cultural flashpoint, one that reignited long-standing debates about privilege, justice, and the value of women's lives, even among the richest and most insulated. News of the murder, the cover-up, and the initial resistance of the powerful dynasty to face consequences splashed across every major media outlet. Glittering studio anchors, true crime podcasters, and impassioned community leaders found sudden unity in their demand for accountability. The narrative transcended gossip. It stoked a righteous fury that pulsed through social media, igniting hashtags like #JusticeForCharlotte and sparking viral video tributes that reached millions. Digital activists banded together, sharing timelines, piecing together evidence released in court, and launching online petitions that quickly gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. People who would otherwise never cross paths, students, celebrities, lawmakers, survivors of abuse, stood united, demanding answers. Within days, New York City streets were awash with protesters. Vigils bloomed on the steps of the courthouse and in Central Park, where mourners carried candlelit photographs and hand-drawn signs. Major women's rights and victims' advocacy groups coordinated rallies not only in New York, but in Washington, Boston, Los Angeles, London, and Paris. At each gathering, community leaders and survivors told their stories, linking Charlotte's fate with a global call to end violence and impunity. Media coverage was relentless, and this time unyielding to pressure from above. Every attempt by the Chase PR machine to redirect or soften the headlines crumbled against the velocity of the public anger. A swirl of columnists and op-eds dissected every facet of the tragedy, from the architecture of generational wealth that enabled such a cover-up to the institutional failures that almost let a murderer slip away. TV roundtables hosted fierce debates, bringing lawyers, psychologists, activists, and commentators together in real time. For weeks, it was impossible to avoid the conversation. In coffee shops, college lectures, and living rooms nationwide, people asked themselves whether their justice system could ever be trusted to stand up to the might of a family like the Chases. What made this moment so visceral, a true watershed, was just how personal the story felt. For millions of women and their allies, Charlotte was suddenly someone they knew. Her struggle painfully echoed their own brushes with danger, dismissal, or disbelief. Stories flowed into newsrooms and social feeds, tales of ignored pleas for help, of protection denied because of a perpetrator's influence, of justice delayed until the world stopped watching. The outrage was raw but also purposeful, fusing individual grief into a wave of collective action. Movements with long histories sprang into new life. Organizations focused on domestic abuse, legal reform, and women's empowerment ramped up outreach, fundraising, and awareness drives. They pressured politicians to revisit stalled bills aimed at closing legal loopholes for wealthy defendants. Marches across state capitals demanded stricter accountability for household employees who witnessed but failed to intervene, and for institutions that had quietly settled previous incidents involving the privileged. Meanwhile, celebrities brought global attention to the cause. A-list actors spoke out during award shows, influential athletes wore armbands and jackets emblazoned with Charlotte's name, and the rallying cry for justice. International figures, from British royalty to Nobel Peace Laureates, offered condolences and publicized the movement, framing the case as not simply a local crime or a quirk of American inequality, but a universal crisis of gender-based violence and judicial integrity. Political ramifications followed swiftly. City council meetings overflowed as citizens demanded that public officials refuse all future contributions from the Chase family and other powerful lobbying interests. Congressional hearings on the relationship between wealth, privacy, and the justice system were scheduled, with Charlotte's family and their advocates at the witness table. At the national level, efforts to pass the Charlotte Carter Act, an omnibus reform aimed at strengthening protection for victims and whistleblowers, gathered unprecedented bipartisan support. These developments, so often stymied by partisan gridlock, now found momentum in a rare moment of united outrage. Through all this public tumult, the Carters, Charlotte's family, emerged as improbable but powerful symbols of transparency and dignity. Ambassador Carter, drawing on decades of diplomatic experience, addressed the nation from the steps of the courthouse. His words, grief-stricken yet composed, called not just for justice for his daughter, but for a world where no family could be so impervious to scrutiny, where every victim could rely on the promise of law over power. The speech was replayed endlessly, galvanizing a population hungry for principled leadership. The impact of Charlotte's case reverberated outward for months, even years, after the trial began. Academic conferences and community panels debated the legacy of the tragedy, urging new conversations about the intersection of money, power, and violence. Law schools dissected the legal maneuvers employed in the Chase defense, using the case as a modern-day parable of systemic rot and the possibility of institutional redemption. Artists created murals, plays, and prose tributes to Charlotte, transforming the city's public spaces into living memorials. Most profound of all, perhaps, was the lasting sense of vigilance her story awoke. School curriculums added modules on consent, bystander intervention, and the red flags of manipulation. Corporate boards reviewed whistleblower protections and moved to adopt stricter safeguards for employees. Justice for Charlotte became shorthand for a refusal to ignore abuse, regardless of where it hides or how much money tries to bury it. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, crowds still gathered in New York and cities around the world to remember not just Charlotte, but all those failed first by the people closest to them, and then by the systems meant to protect them. The intense legal battle and tactics of the defendant. The legal battle that followed the initial investigation of Charlotte Carter's murder was as grueling and complex as any in American legal history. The moment the Chase family realized that Alexander would be charged with homicide, their machinery of influence transitioned from damage control to a full-scale defense operation, determined to undermine the prosecution at every turn. From the outset, the Chases assembled a veritable army of the nation's top criminal defense attorneys, drawn from the storied halls of white-shoe firms in New York, Boston, and Washington. D.C. lead counsel was a legal legend known for his theatrics in court and ability to sway juries with emotional appeals, a man who had previously secured acquittals for celebrities and politicians alike. Alongside him were a cadre of trial consultants, digital forensics experts, media strategists, and a host of private investigators. Together, they didn't just prepare to defend Alexander, they set out to question the very validity of the justice system itself. At the heart of the defense were a series of coordinated strategies. First came the relentless push for dismissal on technicalities, challenging the search warrants, questioning the chain of custody for key evidence, proclaiming violation of the accused's rights due to alleged excessive pressure in the initial interrogation. Motions to suppress digital evidence, phone records, video footage, and security logs filled court dockets, each crafted to cast doubt and confusion. The defense team even attempted to spin the initial delay in police response as evidence of official incompetence, suggesting the true assailant must have escaped while authorities were tied up at the front gate. Simultaneously, Alexander's attorneys initiated an aggressive media campaign. Carefully curated leaks, off-the-record briefings, and sympathetic interviews formed the first wave of a public relations offensive aimed at shaping public perception. In a calculated move, the family secured prime television interviews with leading anchors, where their spokesperson painted Alexander as a troubled young man, pushed to the brink by relentless social pressures, substance abuse, and the weight of family expectations. They invoked the language of mental health crises, a strategy crafted as much for the court of public opinion as for the actual courtroom. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the defense explored every possible avenue to destabilize the prosecution's narrative. Psychiatrists and medical experts were brought in who claimed, under oath, that Alexander suffered from a previously undiagnosed dissociative condition, one that could explain violent outbursts and memory lapses. Defense filings began to paint a picture of diminished capacity. Attorneys filed for psychiatric evaluation, slowing proceedings to a crawl and inviting endless rounds of debate on Alexander's mental competency to stand trial. In response, prosecutors were forced to assemble their own experts and commission independent psychiatric assessments. Each side battled relentlessly over medical records and test results. The defense pushed narratives ranging from temporary insanity to PTSD from childhood trauma, at every turn seeking a way to soften culpability or, if possible, convince the jury that Alexander was more victim than perpetrator. No less aggressive were attempts to discredit the central evidence. The defense zeroed in on digital anomalies, suggesting that the Chase Mansion's sophisticated security system could have been hacked by an outside party. They floated vague theories of a third party accessing the property, raising the specter of an unidentified intruder. Every piece of forensic evidence, DNA, fingerprints, the panic-coded texts and emails, was subjected to scrutiny by their hired experts, whose testimonies invariably identified reasonable doubt wherever possible. The defense even accused police technicians of mishandling Charlotte's cell phone, implying that critical messages could have been planted or deleted. Similarly, the defense attacked eyewitness credibility. Household staff were questioned mercilessly about their memories and motives. Some were implied to be spiteful ex-employees, others painted as unreliable due to immigration status or alleged previous misconduct. At one point, the legal team attempted to imply bias within the investigation itself by highlighting donations made by the Carter family to police charities, an effort to suggest institutional favoritism toward Charlotte's family. Perhaps most controversial was the attempt to reverse victim and perpetrator roles. The defense publicly disseminated stories about supposed volatility in Charlotte's character, leaking fragments of old private correspondence and testimonials crafted to exaggerate moments of vulnerability, thus feeding into ugly, sexist stereotypes. They floated the suggestion of a mutual confrontation gone tragically wrong, downplaying Charlotte's injuries as a byproduct of a chaotic struggle, rather than evidence of intentional violence. With public sentiment roaring and protests swelling outside the courthouse, the defense doubled down on delay tactics. They filed for change of venue, first to a suburban county, then to another state, arguing that Alexander could not possibly get a fair trial due to media coverage and prejudgment. Each new motion added weeks or months, stretching pre-trial maneuvering into a seemingly endless campaign of attrition. Behind the scenes, the chase team quietly attempted to contact potential jurors, scrutinizing social media profiles and personal ties, and raising subtle challenges designed to dismiss anyone deemed unsympathetic to wealth or privilege. Throughout, Alexander's demeanor became a flashpoint for speculation. On some days, he arrived in court visibly frail, clutching a prescription bottle and head bowed, his legal team whispering about his need for medical breaks. Other times he presented as composed but haunted, only to break down in brief, dramatic fits at emotionally charged moments. Psychologists and media consultants coached every twitch and tear, knowing that the line between perceived remorse and calculated showmanship was perilously thin. The defense played on public sympathy any way possible, while also seeking to manufacture ambiguity around even the most damning evidence. Meanwhile, the prosecution built an airtight case, leveraging digital traces, eyewitness testimony, forensic timelines, and patterns of Alexander's past conduct, painting a damning portrait of the entitlement bred by unaccountable power. Prosecutors anticipated every feint by the defense. They brought forward expert witnesses on trauma, digital forensics, and behavioral profiling. They meticulously tracked the sequence of security lockdowns and the financial hush payments to staff. They introduced social media evidence that showed Alexander's attempt to manipulate witnesses and destroy data after the fact. The defense's last desperate act was to propose a plea deal. They floated options, from voluntary manslaughter to involuntary homicide, hoping to reduce Alexander's sentence in exchange for a public apology and large restitution to Charlotte's family. But public outrage made this impossible. Protesters assailed the district attorney's office, and Charlotte's parents vowed never to accept compromise on their daughter's life. Each attempt at negotiating a lighter sentence was summarily rejected by the court. As the trial wound on, the defense played every card at their disposal. They alleged procedural misconduct, accused law enforcement of collaborating with the media, and petitioned for the exclusion of key evidence. The legal wrangling grew fiercer as each tactic failed, dragging the proceedings into months of stilted progress. The relentless attack on the justice system, however, only served to draw even greater scrutiny from the public and press. Advocacy groups mobilized, demanding stricter rules on courtroom delays and stiffer penalties for attempts to intimidate or bribe witnesses. Commentators debated the ethics of high-priced defense, and law professors used the case as a cautionary example of the challenges posed when vast private resources are pitted against the people's quest for justice. Ultimately, no amount of legal maneuvering could erase the clarity of evidence and the moral outrage that gripped the nation. The trial became a crucible, not only for the accused, but for American faith in the legal system. When the verdict finally arrived, it became clear that neither privilege nor spectacle could shield even the most powerful from the demands of accountability. An appropriate sentence and legal message. The culmination of the trial, the pronouncement of a just sentence, marked not only a climactic moment for the Carter and Chase families, but for the entire nation watching with bated breath. This was far more than a single courtroom outcome. The moment became a referendum on the power of law in the face of entrenched privilege, an answer to the question, does justice truly hold sway when the accused wields generational influence and unimaginable resources? On the final day, the courthouse was surrounded by throngs of protesters, TV vans, advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens. After months of painstaking presentations and bruising legal battles, the jury returned with its verdict. Alexander Washington Chase was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, unlawful imprisonment, evidence tampering, and criminal conspiracy. Additionally, several staff and family accomplices faced charges ranging from obstruction of justice to perjury and witness intimidation. The judge, in her closing statement, was unflinching. She cited the unique gravity of the crime and the calculated attempts to subvert the truth for personal and familial benefit. "No one, no matter their name or fortune, is above the law," the judge intoned, her words echoing beyond the packed courtroom and into living rooms across the country. The sentence was severe: life without parole, additional decades for related offenses, and millions in financial restitution to Charlotte's loved ones. For the staff and complicit family members, sentences ranged from years-long prison terms to community service, permanent disbarment, and heavy fines. What set this verdict apart in the annals of U.S. justice was not only its thoroughness, but the clarity of the message it sent. In handing down the harshest penalties the law provided, the court directly addressed the centuries-old American debate about equality before the law. The judge's statement was quoted in national debates, legal textbooks, even on protest banners. "The foundation of civil society is trust in the law. If the law bends for the powerful, it breaks for everyone." From that day, the implications rippled far beyond one family's downfall. The verdict became a case study in American universities and a rallying point in legislative hearings. Lawmakers called for reforms targeting loopholes that allowed such obstructions, stricter oversight of private security, bans on hush payments in criminal investigations, and the creation of anonymous whistleblower channels within elite households. Lawyers and judges debated new rules limiting delay tactics and raising standards for digital evidence protection. For the legal system itself, the case instigated reforms both practical and philosophical. Training programs for law enforcement and prosecutors began to emphasize the dangers of deference to influential defendants. Victim advocacy groups gained traction for projects embedded in elite communities, ensuring the voices of employees, service workers, and guests would not be silenced by NDAs or intimidation. Even law schools across America added this trial to their ethics curricula, dissecting both the attempts at obstruction and the unusual firmness of the court's final decision. Yet the true power of the sentence resided in its social symbolism. For decades, cynicism had eroded public faith in high-profile cases, with many convinced that money could always buy a gentler verdict. Here, the nation watched as privilege failed to sway the scales, and countless citizens, especially women, took solace and inspiration from the court's resolve. Families from all walks of life followed the trial, using its verdict as a teaching point. Wealth cannot be allowed to shield wrongdoers, and true justice demands vigilance and integrity from all levels of society. The judge's closing words, replayed across networks and streamed in multiple languages, distilled the essence of the moment. Today, this court honors not only the life taken, but the principle that no barrier, however tall, can stand before the law. To everyone who, in small or large ways, seeks to silence, to bribe, or to shield, from this day forward let it be known, accountability is real, and justice will be done. In the aftermath, the case was referenced by advocates of gender equality, anti-violence campaigns, and legal reformers alike, its shadow long and transformative. For Charlotte Carter's family, the sentence could not annul their grief, but it delivered the balm of vindication and public acknowledgement. For American society, it marked a symbolic rebirth of confidence in the idea that when justice is truly blind, even the highest walls cannot stop its reach. Social meaning and conclusion. In the aftermath of such a sensational and deeply tragic case, the social impact reverberated for years, far beyond the courtroom walls and the gilded gates of the Chase family estate. This was no longer just the story of two influential families or a high-profile crime. It became a cultural milestone, a catalyst for national introspection, and ultimately, a call to action for meaningful change in American society and beyond. The verdict, unyielding and uncompromising, shattered long-held public cynicism that the privileged always walk free, regardless of the crime. People from all walks of life, particularly women and those in vulnerable situations, drew strength from the precedent that had been set, proof that the law, when pursued with relentless integrity and transparency, can safeguard even those who seem powerless against titanic wealth and influence. The case became a touchstone for numerous advocacy groups, Women's organizations, legal reformists, and civil rights activists cited it in their campaigns and literature as a breaking point in public tolerance for privilege shielding criminality. Legislatively, a wave of reform followed. Lawmakers in several states, as well as on the federal level, began introducing bills that directly addressed issues exposed by the case: tougher regulations on non-disclosure agreements in cases of violence or abuse, greater scrutiny and checklists for private in-home security staff, mandatory reporting protocols for staff at elite households, and heightened penalties for evidence tampering and witness intimidation. The phrase "no one is above the law," spoken by the trial judge, became a rallying cry repeated in statehouses and public squares. These shifts were not mere rhetoric. Within months, multiple laws had passed increasing protections for staff and guests in homes of the ultra-wealthy, strengthening whistleblower immunity, and requiring independent review of evidence in high-profile criminal cases. The educational system, too, absorbed the lessons. Universities incorporated the case into law school curricula, not just in criminal justice courses but in philosophy, ethics, political science, and gender studies. Classroom debates raged on the meaning and limits of privilege, power, and moral responsibility. High school teachers referenced the story in civics lessons, discussing the practical mechanisms of justice, the importance of jury duty, and the responsibilities that come with any position of trust. Survivors of abuse and injustice often use the symbol of Charlotte Carter's case to motivate students, showing that the push for accountability can be long, grueling, and dangerous, but it is never futile. Perhaps most visibly, the arts and media took up the case as well. Documentaries, novels, podcasts, and dramatic retellings examined every angle, sometimes sensationalizing, yes, but more often illuminating the real social issues at the heart of the tragedy. The conversations they sparked forced audiences to confront uncomfortable facts: how often wealth has hidden brutality, how easy it is to look away rather than confront the powerful, how collective silence becomes complicity. The social impact did not stop at new laws or media coverage. Nonprofit organizations experienced dramatic increases in calls for help, donations, and survivor testimonials referencing Charlotte's story. Hotlines documented a surge in individuals, especially domestic staff, guests, and women in elite environments, seeking advice or protection strategies inspired by the new legal landscape. At the same time, a cultural reckoning unfolded among the upper echelons of society. Generationally wealthy families and corporate boards were compelled to revisit their own household policies, scrutinizing NDAs, security procedures, and internal complaint channels. Some public figures, long protected by institutional silence, found themselves facing new investigations or the loss of prestigious positions. Social clubs and philanthropic organizations amended their charters, adding clauses protecting against retaliation, and invited survivor advocates to educate members on power abuse and mental health support. Parallel to policy shifts and institutional reforms, the case provoked deep, sometimes painful reflection within American families, especially those raising daughters. The Carter family, who endured profound grief in the public eye, channeled their pain into action. They established a charitable foundation in Charlotte's name, funding scholarships for survivors of abuse and endowing research on violence prevention. Their advocacy reshaped victim support networks and pushed for greater public oversight. Interviews with family members were widely shared, their messages emphasizing vigilance, the courage to speak up, and the conviction that change is possible even when the system is stacked against you. Internationally, the impact was equally significant. The story circulated around the world, highlighting global issues of gender violence, legal immunity, and the toxic intersections of privilege and silence. Activists in countries with similar challenges found resonance and motivation, sparking coalitions for reform as far away as Europe, Asia, and South America. Human rights groups referenced the case in petitions to the United Nations, framing it as a cautionary tale and a hopeful precedent for others trapped by power imbalances. Within American domestic politics, the fallout was lasting. Politicians and advocacy leaders used the case to galvanize voter support for anti-corruption and equality measures. Debates intensified around judicial appointments, police procedure reform, oversight for private security, and even the structure of inheritance law. For the first time in decades, certain protections that benefited only the elite faced real threat of reversal. The principle that justice must not bend to status or money, long idealized, often ignored, became tangible, enforceable policy. This change was slow, messy, and in the eyes of many, still incomplete, but it had unmistakably begun. The resolution of the case also marked a shift in social attitudes toward bystander responsibility. In the months that followed, everyday Americans saw themselves reflected in the actions or inaction of household staff, neighbors, and institutional actors surrounding the crime. Public campaigns promoted the importance of intervention and the lethal costs of silence. "If you see something, say something," moved from subway posters into the heart of the national conversation, with new training programs and reporting tools extended to every segment of society. Workplaces, universities, and even religious institutions began hosting seminars inspired by the case, leading to a subtle but real questioning of how power should be balanced, checked, and, when necessary, countered. More abstractly, the narrative became a lens through which Americans re-examined themes long ingrained in their culture: the myth of meritocracy, the responsibilities of wealth, and the seductive pull of legacy and tradition. In panel discussions and op-eds, writers debated whether this watershed moment could spark enduring change, or would, like scandals past, eventually fade into the background. The strength of the national response, however, suggested this time was different. Roots of change had reached deep. Personally, for many, closure remained elusive. For survivors and the Carter family, the loss could never be repaid by any verdict, sentence, or donation. Yet in the quiet aftermath, citizens found inspiration in their resilience and public advocacy. Their willingness to transform private grief into public courage was celebrated in vigils, memorials, and countless personal tributes nationwide. The memory of Charlotte Carter became a symbol of both tragedy and possibility, the price paid and the promise kept that future generations would not be ignored or abandoned in their hour of need. The resolution of the case, then, was more than a legal conclusion. It was the ignition of a broader reckoning with the American soul, a confrontation with the realities of privilege, violence, and the power of collective will to demand something better. In every city, town, and small community, people found new language and clearer frameworks to protect one another, to challenge systems that had failed for too long, and to approach the future with renewed hope and vigilance. Ultimately, the story's end was less about the closure of a scandal and more about societal renewal. Its greatest legacy was the individuals it empowered, the structures it challenged, and the standard it set for future battles for justice. It became a constant reminder: the fight for safety, respect, and genuine equity never ends, and even in the darkest narratives, there remains space for transformation, dignity, and hard-won progress for everyone.